So we have Kane, we have a slide deck here that you can look at that explains a lot of our, a lot of the debugging tips that we have, getting your makefile ready, Valgrind, etc. Input redirection, get line, get up long, lots of useful stuff. That's really important for the projects. And I highly recommend you take a look at that. And this is, I intend for this to be sort of like an encyclopedia. So here's, if you want to use Valgrind, here's a tutorial. If you want to use perf, you can check out the miscellaneous guide, the slide deck. Address sanitizer. You can go to the 280 tutorial and take a look at that. And Valgrind is a mechanism to find memory errors. Perf is a mechanism to see how well your code is performing in terms of time complexity, and address sanitizers similar to Valgrind in finding memory errors. These are really useful tools for debugging and optimization that I'd recommend. Now, the next part is Linux Kane, rsync, SCP, Linux commands, Linux GDB, Mac LLDB, right? So a lot of you aren't super familiar with the command line, so I highly recommend you take a look at this basics Linux command cheat sheet tutorial, such that you are familiar and adept with the command line and you can modify files quite easily and move around different directories, create directories, delete things, etc. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is that your code is run on Linux Kane and compiled on Linux Kane, right? So it's important that you're familiar with Kane, how to get into it, how to develop on it, etc. So I highly recommend you take a look at that tutorial. Another issue is transferring files to Kane, right? So typically what I recommend is before you submit to the autograder, transfer your files to Kane using two sources, either rsync or SCP. Then make sure it compiles. If there is an issue, debug it, fix it, and then submit to the autograder. This makes sure that you don't waste submits, right? Now, let's say you transferred all your files to Kane, and then there's some error, right? There's some issue. Well, you can just edit it on Kane through the terminal using Vim. So here's a useful cheat sheet tutorial that you can use there. Additionally, let's say you have to debug on Kane, because once you moved all your files over, it was an issue, you edit it in Vim, and now you want to check that it works. You can debug on Kane command line using GDB. So it's important that you got familiar with this as well. And lastly, I think this is the most important, debugging on the Mac command line. Now, my sort of thinking with this is if there's ever an issue with your IDE, you can pop up your terminal, use LLDB, and debug your code through the command line. Who knows, maybe, there's some software update that causes some issues with the IDE, right? It's important to have a backup, and this is a great backup to use in case you have some issue with your IDE. And lastly, GitHub Desktop. So it's important to use version control just to make sure that you can, you have a safe storage place for your code. You can roll back changes if necessary, etc. So I have a document linking to 280's Git tutorial. And I also use GitHub Desktop, right? That allows me to, sorry, I didn't link to the one thing. So I also use GitHub Desktop, which is a GUI interface to push and pull commit from Git. And I found that to be pretty helpful. And lastly, you can use GitHub on Kane through the command line. So let's say instead of moving files to and from Kane, maybe you can just push to GitHub and then pull from GitHub on the Kane command line, right? Maybe you prefer that. Maybe that's simpler for you. That's an option here. I've linked to a few places where you can go and get that set up. My sort of like goal with the miscellaneous guide, the sort of the coding tips section at the end of this tutorial, is to make sure that you're familiar with the tools that we have and you have some sort of fail-safe or backup, right? You can't legislate away failure. You should have some sort of backup. I'm not asking you to memorize every GDB command, but you should be familiar with it, right? You should have some idea of how it works. So in case you have some issue with your IDE, you can use GDB, or let's say rsync is not working for you. You can use SCP, right? It's having that sort of redundancy that is important for being the most productive as a computer scientist in this class. We really don't want you to be stuck on some obscure IDE issue when our goal is really to have you focus on the core of data structures and algorithms. And this sort of end section of the tutorial is meant for you to unblock yourself, right? So before you post on Piazza, I highly recommend you come back to this document, you take a look at all of this and see if you can resolve your issue. So yeah, besides that, good luck. If you have any questions about this, please post on Piazza, but that's the end of the tutorial.